Good morning, everyone. I was not expecting to go first. I thought I would hear from Europe before we turn to the rest of the world. But life does not always go as expected, or I didn't read your email carefully enough. So good morning, everyone. My first time in Rome and in Italy, so very excited, but I haven't seen much yet. Very nice to see all of you here. I'm going to start by saying that Europe is looking to Asia. We notice that. But what are the kinds of stories that Europe is looking at? And what should it be perhaps looking at? That's what I'm going to start with. I think more than ever, there is a need to nuance Asia. Asia can very easily be subsumed by the great giants, India included, China, Indonesia. But I think we have to look beyond. This is now critical, and it doesn't happen often enough. I think we also need to, from Europe, look for stories in Asia, mainly around the sustainability of the cultural sector. As someone working at the Asia-Europe Foundation, looking at how the cultural sector is built here in Europe and back in Asia, we see that for me, one of the most fundamental questions or the most interesting questions to ask of Asia is how, in a system with very little, let's say, stable, reliant funding for culture from anywhere, be it corporates or the state, is an entire continent organizing itself for having a sustainable cultural ecosystem, sustainable cultural networks, sustainable arts organizations, sustainable artistic careers, all of which are happening with, let's say, frugal innovation. We have a word for it in India called Jugaad. Everything works like that, but we have created, I think, sometimes a system out of it. And I think there are interesting stories there. I was recently at a discussion on cultural networks in Asia and Europe, and at the end of the discussion, when the Asians finally revealed that, hey, but we're doing all this with zero money, zero secretariat, zero support, but we're still doing it, we're still networked, I think there are stories there. And those stories need to be exchanged a bit more. Asia is still looking to Europe, not really for technical expertise, as it used to be the case in the past, but for other things. I think the most important thing that we're looking for is that we're still fascinated by the idea that the artist is really getting recognition here as a professional. We're still very far from this in many parts of Asia. An artist is sometimes just an eccentric, and to get that status from government on the paperwork that you do, on the taxes that you file, I think that's very big and important. We're also looking, I think, about looking for public recognition from some of our states for contemporary creativity as a sort of a symbolic space for artistic expression, as a safe space for unsafe ideas. It doesn't always exist in many parts of Asia. And I think, again, there we look to Europe. We have been looking to Europe. The role that the arts community and the CSOs play in advocacy, again, here something that Asia is looking to Europe, and the participatory mechanisms that exist for state and civil society, especially the arts sector, to speak, because in Asia there's very much of an antagonistic relationship in many parts of Asia between the state and between those in the arts sector. And I think these are areas in which we are looking to Europe. And now putting the two together, Asia and Europe. I work in a publicly funded organization that connects Asia and Europe, and we also receive support from the EU, but not from the EU alone, but Asia as well. And I think, and I read the background paper of Culture Action Europe for this conference, and I think the fundamental thing is to somehow keep increasing support for non-commercial cultural exchange. I think that is at the heart of everything that we are doing, and we should be doing. And to look beyond the obvious in terms of formats. The trainings that we sometimes organize can be patronizing. Conferences do not allow for the slow, immersive, peer-to-peer exchanges that I think are really needed in these times. Just meeting someone for a day at a conference is not enough to promote Asia-Europe connections. So I think looking at peer-to-peer, slow, immersive models is critical. We have to fund as much of co-creations as we possibly can, but I think there's a lot of politics behind co-creation. Who puts more money gets to make the editorial decisions. So co-creation is not as easy as just naming something a co-creation fund. And I see this every day in my work at the Asia-Europe Foundation. Most things which are co-created are not co-created. So I think Asia is looking for equal partnerships. It's looking for cultural fair trade. It's not looking for technical expertise from Europe. And I think that's a very exciting place to be in, but it's also very difficult in terms of programming. Mobility and visa, the usual suspects, always a problem. I was just telling some colleagues here this morning that I had to declare 6 months of salary slip, bank statements, my marital status, parents' travel history before I could get a visa to be here today. That's the reality of this, though I'm backed by an institution that helps me at least get to the embassy. So these are very real challenges. I think Europe should invest more in mobility for cultural operators outside Europe to come and spend some time here to understand how things work. That's critical, so the reciprocity has to be there. It's not enough to send Europeans outward, but to bring the rest of the world, including Asians, in here. And I think last but not the least, turning to heritage, because next year will be the year of heritage here. I think Asia needs to see a much more nuanced Europe in terms of seeing it as a multicultural space, especially its minority cultures. So I think there's a lot of scope there for exchange between curators, museum professionals, looking at these aspects, the more nuanced aspect of Europe, because I think more than ever, the cultural programs that we devise now are critical to building cultural exchange as a sort of safe space for unsafe ideas, especially because also in Asia, there are a lot of anxieties now around cultural differences. And I think cultural exchange and the way we program it can change the discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes. And thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to me among friends, colleagues, for many years, both of European Cultural Foundation and myself. Thanks to Vasil and to Sylvia for your wonderful introductions. What I wanted to start on first, because I was quite grabbed, if I may, by the title of Spotlight on the Future of Culture in Europe, of culture in brackets. And what this brought to mind for me was the notion of a figure skating arena and an extravaganza in the beginning part of it, all of the follow spots going through the crowd, putting their light on the crowd or the ice or trying to catch the moving target of the skater. Now, I know most of this is automated now, but give me the slightly romantic illusion of somebody actually holding that follow spot and trying to catch that skater or that performer at a particular moment and follow them. And we have we are so, I'm not sure if it's more or less, but I'm becoming more and more anxious myself at this increasing discussion of the uncertainty of the future. Is our future really as uncertain as any other futures? Or is it just moving faster and faster? Or are we as people really saying we need to have an answer before it's there? And that puts us in a very tricky spot, back to all of the follow spots again. And how can we come to a point where we can perhaps bring those together? Have we lost an ability that we had to recognize patterns and be able to see where we might focus that line? Or we're just waiting for somebody else to show us where that follow spot should be, what direction we can take? Or is it simply that there's so much flashing around, so many different follow spots at the same time, distracting attention, and really, where do we start? What challenge do we look at first? And is it at all possible to unpick and disentangle challenges that are so intricately woven? The issues and concerns of inequality, unease, and uncertainty that all combine and result in this increasing fragmentation, disintegration of our solidarity, and a retrenchment into that concept of I, whether that I is a person or a community or a country. but that retrenchment into I, and where we need to reinforce right now the understanding of we, and the absolute necessity that that understanding of we is the most inclusive one that we can imagine. But, and for me it's always a huge but, and all of you in the room I think recognize that in the face of all of these things, there is an enormous possibility, and we know the power of the many actions, whether they're small or large actions, cultural actions, activities, processes that are stepping up to build that we, to build a greater understanding of that we, and to really, truly seek change and work towards a transformational change which we need in our societies, in our economies, in our world. Individuals, artists, organizations are doing what they know best to engage people in cultural processes that really do talk about possibility and not impossibility. And then all of those many, as a network, you can experience this, and many very local actions, those very personal ones that are addressing, in fact, global challenges, even though they're doing that from a very individual place, in a very specific place. And our task, I speak the hour as us and the European Cultural Foundation, is to not only find, foster, but also facilitate those initiatives, to grow those ideas, and to connect and link them together, because it is in fact that interconnection, that interdependence that we have as people, as locality to locality. For me, that is what is Europe, and that is what has to be our understanding of the globe, of the world. As a networked, resilient and interlocal, and exciting and dynamic and diverse web. As Anupama said, this idea of people to people, peer to peer is what we need to be the basis, whether it's in our communities or whether it is across a country, across a continent, or more importantly, around the world. We do need to understand that culture is a space. It's a space in which we can move from I to we, and that diversity and equality needs to drive that space. That culture is a process of engagement and a stimulus for action. It can reinforce, and it does reinforce, resilient communities. And culture really needs to be at the table or in the tent, whichever metaphor you choose, and we need to think beyond ourselves as a cultural sector. Katherine mentioned the thinking of being in a bubble or in our own particular world, or focused on our what we feel our own issues, even though they are important ones, and to lift ourselves up and know we need to be taking that into a shared understanding of bringing all of our follow spots together into the big challenges that we need to face, whether that is the responsibility for shepherding our planet, for the environment, for social justice and equality, or better said, inequality, and the move towards a transformation to a fair and a new economy. So it's certainly welcome and timely, I must say, Sylvia, that the ministers are discussing education and culture, even if it is over lunch, because if we use many of those old adages that the way to a person's heart may in fact be through their stomach, or that is the greatest food for thought that we can offer. So being at the lunch meeting is being there, but we do need to be, and it is good to know that culture and education are within or around the lunch table. My job, our job, and all of our job, I do believe, is to shine that spotlight and to connect, to champion, and to amplify. So maybe now just a very few words about Europe, with certainly much appreciation, Vasil, for your presentation, for your keynote. I think perhaps now than ever before, the European Cultural Foundation, if I can speak from our perspective, but I think the Culture Action Europe mission is needed and urgently needed, that we need to trespass over our own boundaries, outside of our own borders, and break out of a legacy that many, unfortunately, still in Europe still hold on to, that Europe is the center of all else. And it's just not the case. You know, it doesn't take much just to zoom back and see that it's a very small and rather finite space. But it is one that has the power and the ability to really take a position in the world that is leading, is saying that things need to change. And our connected world needs to become a more interdependent world, and to understand that and to believe it. And that Europe has this role in the globe in addressing global challenges, not just European challenges, but these are indeed global challenges, to move from the idea of I to we, so that Europe is not an I, but it is part of a we. And that one way we can get there is through culture. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would say a lot is already said, and it was very well said. And I would say from the global perspective, and I think for the debate later, and I think it was coming to the realities of co-creation, and I was very inspired by the element of who make decisions there in the way we work together. But in the first place, I think when I was looking at the list, and you said it very well, the community here as cultural workers and activists, I could only modestly add from the Brussels perspective. It's when I came in at BOZAR as a interdisciplinary art center and intersectorial in the heart of Europe, and being there, it was since, I would say, one of the last crises, because I'm 54, and since the 70s, Belgium is a country we tried to live together, because everywhere I'm coming, always they ask me, you're still not in war, or what's going on? And I think with what happened recently in Spain, I think it's a lot of reflection we can have how we handle democracy these days, when we heard this morning the keynote speech, and how we need to make compromises to live together inside the European space. And as Mercedes said it very well, and also my colleagues, I think if we speak about Brussels and in the recent new acts, German, French acts of power in Europe, it's more than that. It's more than Brussels, it's more than Germany and France, and it's more than borders and security. It's that European space. And that European space, who already during the Cold War was created by the Council of Europe, and we always forget a little bit all these multilateral organizations who came much before we were involved in the way we are thinking. And I think that in this whole storytelling from our perspective is certainly to bring again in this debate this morning, in the two questions you were asking for, is the artist. In which way he can bring a debate. And I remember for myself, the first debate organized by the Goethe Institute was to have two writers, Günter and Bodo Strauss, on realities of decolonization in the 70s, 80s. That was one of the most important momentums I remember as a child. During the last decades, and being in a lot of performances, and certainly in our debate on how artists can be part of that, I saw many of these projects, and it's interesting to see which perspective it was. When Peter Brook did the Mahabharata, or Mushkin was doing Prince Sihanouk, was one of the most important storytelling about what happened in our relation with Asia and Europe. When the wall came down with Yo-Yo Ma, and UNESCO, and at the time the European Union, started to do a Silk Road project, the perspective of the Silk Road, for which perspective why we see China today making this happen. And as a platform, and being squeezed after the Second World War between America and on one hand a former ideology of making modernity, where you were referring to what was the West European model, and on the other hand the Soviet Union. And today and you said it very well, on the numbers of narratives, not knowing well which narratives in this feeling of fear and unfair, two very important elements of discussion we need to have. The feel of citizens to feel fear and to feel unfair is certainly two fundamental elements that intellectuals, scientists have to discuss together. And in the way we work at BOZAR, besides being a platform of advocacy, in the way of bringing modernity in, and all that was said also this morning, is education. Education in the project of Imagine Europe. If we can't say it anymore by words in the European Parliament, maybe we can translate it in images. And therefore, the Lux Prize and all these different prizes from the theater to the cinema to literature, that these narratives are so fundamental to show in another way the way we are living together in Europe and in this European space together with the others. Then second part, coming to the cultural diplomatic and cultural diplomacy, and certainly in the way we think these days, is certainly this co-creation in a way of being equal. But at the reality, the format is not easy, certainly in the way the political bodies are still thinking, even inside the European Union. We see that EAC and the Creative Europe program is already very far and can still make fundamental mental changes. But when we see AIS on the level of the foreign policy, it's like something very new. A lot has to be learned, even inside European bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is democracy, how they have to handle. So don't see the European space as a global project where everybody's thinking the same way. There's a big difference with what already in the subsidiarity of the cultural works was already done and said already by discussed this morning. But the new policy, since I learned after the Second World War that what was public diplomacy by the Americans and propaganda by the most of the other countries. And I was reporting the report will be at lunch in Göteborg and seeing on the digital investments from the side of Asia, China, America and Europe. And we have not to change on technology, but on I would say contents and creative thinking in the way we can exchange, and the fascination we had always for Asia. It's not new. It's a long storytelling, and we are always referring to the recent history. There's a longer reality of affinity. If you go to the Western Balkan, and Bulgaria is giving priorities to that, and you go around there, you feel very well in language, in references, this long story of influences of, I would say, the divide of the, I would say, the Europe in a more Orthodox Europe, influenced by Russia, the influence of, I would say, the Arab world, Turkey today, the Silk Road, and the Mediterranean. And I think it's important in the coming European presidencies, we will have two countries who will have the first time their presidency in this 100th anniversary of independence and interdependence of countries as Finland, the Baltic, Hungary, and Poland experience freedom related to the freedom in Africa and the reality of what Asia is today and our democratic values. What Mrs. Mogherini said in Brussels 2 years ago in the Cultural Forum, can we still tell these stories to the others outside of the European space and economic space if we don't respect anymore these values inside the European space? All these different elements are certainly for us as Cultural Works in a new form of dialogue, new opportunities, because we're still only on the level of strategy. More Europe is a very small platform. Unique is still very vertical, very bilateral, referring to the nuclear deal. Each of the European countries, Italy, France, Germany, were making immediately bilateral deals, not in a common reality. And at the same time, I think the economic realities, I'm always very impressed when I see what my colleagues with very, very limited means and budget are doing. At the same time, our ambitions have to be much more than that, related to what I see inside this European space as outside the European space. So that's certainly in the element we can translate the concepts to education, to artists, to be part of that debate, and that's our responsibility in Brussels, to inspire, to empower, together with a lot of you, stakeholders, to make that happen, that the European Parliament, the most democratic body who can still change, I hope so, in the near future, can be an element of partnership together with the world. So that's certainly some of the talking points for this morning. Thank you.
It was in my best interest because, you know, having the chance to exchange with clever people, not only about street halls and that kind of things, is not only refreshing, but it's necessary. And while we are stuck in daily government, the ordinary can be killing. So, so I'll try not to speak of the ordinary. Okay, then I may get back to that. I think that the point you're asking us to address implies or requires just, and Paul was, everybody was doing that once, a kind of historic life. Okay, let's rush back to the late 15th century when whatever we call Europe decided, that its limits were no longer the one in Europe and went out. And since then, the nation that is war in Europe dominated the world, so spoiled the rest of the world. Then let's go. I'm rough. I know it's rough, okay, but just in 19th, 20th century, you added the notion of West. So it was Europe and North America. Still a geopolitical dominance, very strong. Today, 21st century, it's not totally different environment. You still have a shrink Europe, a still big US, no longer West. Trump presidency, it tells clearly that story, at least for now. Asia, that is big, growing. We still speaks about Asia, but it's no longer just simple Asia, because you have China, you have India, you have Korea, and so on. Latin America, that freed itself out from the chain of North American control and different things. And in all along this line, Africa has been missing, whereas it's where the story began. And tomorrow for me, it's very close. So if you look, it took 4 centuries to move from Europe to West, 1 century to move from West to the new situation. So the next one, it's another century, probably less. Is Europe a very small things in the world, whatever it is. So I think that has to be solidly taken into account. And yes, still we have resources, we have kind of marginal technological advantage, and then what does it mean? And is that important? I don't know. So this is for me is in the backdrop. Then I'd like to marginally challenge, even if partially agree, the Catherine's statement on future. You absolutely, through future is always being uncertain. And speed of change is what makes the situation for us unmanageable. But I'd rather add an element, is that what is clearly lacking in this period is voices that envision a future. And whenever in human history you had, lack of vision of the future, failed, you had terrible fuck-ups. I just want, Hitler was the hope for Germany. Mussolini was the hope for Italy. So unless a vision of the future comes and, let's say, connect the hope to a real change for a better future, we will keep living in this continent vision of the future where hope is going in the direction opposite to the one that we all share. And it's a political responsibility and the intellectual responsibility. So this community has a responsibility. And this community, to this end, is silent. And it's not doing a narrative for Europe. It's silent. If you remind me, I'll go back to this point at the end with the specific case in that concerned the political debate in this country over the use of heritage. Okay. So silence, it is a responsibility and has an impact. Also, because silence disempower those in politics that speaks a different language. Because the political language is dominated by a financial vision of time. To this also the media debate abide. So it's everything, it's short and narrow. And media mechanisms tend to set the agenda, the political agenda. I'm not referring to this country only. It's a general things. And if you look at the challenges the classical mass media are undergoing because of the surge of the new media, you see the impact of a community where nothing is no longer controlled. If you read news, every news is reported exactly what has been said by someone. Because you need to generate news at the speed of the social media. You have very few mass media that keep seriously to analyze and research whether the information they got is substantial or not. And politics is dominated by this mechanism. So whenever in politics you have people or topics that try to escape from this mechanism, unless society, and again, the intellectuals, take responsibility to speak this language, there will be not always challenged. That's the minimum. So, the whole good work the cultural comedy can make in the parliament, in order to have voice, the tactics is to get the money into the economic budget, while the comedy itself, and we all say that culture is no longer valuable because it generated GDP, but because it transformed society. And it's a tactic that is determined by the lack of voices. Culture or something else. I mean, in the language, we use the importance of culture. Even the spotlight was culture in Europe. Okay. I'd rather say that the problem today, at least from my point of view, is not culture per se, but the political problem. Okay, it's cultural participation, or better participation in or to cultural life of people. And engagement. That's the second level. Why I say so? Because in my view, a needed answer to the challenges of the time we live is massively dependent by the, the I mean, I cannot avoid to use something that I used with culture action Europe in the past, which is that by the cultural capacities or capabilities that the people developed. Therefore, unless we as individual and community become more curious, more empathic, more, we mentioned several times, we won't be able to drive a societal change which is needed towards a sustainability notion, which is not only environmental, it's social. That, to me, has a profound implication, is that what is enshrined in Article 27 of the Declaration of Human Rights is master. The master is that everybody has the right to participate in culture, enjoy the arts, and benefit of the progress of science. That's the point. That's not the quality of the creation, that's not the life of the artist, that's not all the rest. To me, politically, that is the point. All the rest is functional to this point. Today, I'm not saying in another moment in history, I'd say that this is in this very time of history. To this end, I would consider something. I mean, if what I consider, and I mean, what makes me love the idea of Europe is that it's not a nation state. Actually, no, it's a project that was to overcome the desire generated by nationalism. Therefore, its diplomacy, its cultural diplomacy, cannot be the cultural diplomacy of the national states. It has to be a cultural diplomacy that is based on new culture. It's not selling or promoting the individual culture of the members of the state, but it's creating new culture in cooperation with those that are not part. Because, by the way, our national culture are mostly colonialist, so no problem. I'm coming to this view, the need of overcoming a European Union project which is based on member state that is mandatory, that needs to go to federalism where regions are members of the European Union, not the national states. The decentralized diplomacy, it's, I know that Mercedes doesn't agree on a specific case, but okay, maybe we'll discuss it. We need to regain the role of cities in decentralized cooperation. And this is totally absent in European Union strategy. That's out. And on the contrary, the city needs to find a way, not easy, to cooperate despite the national government and the supranational institution in order to be a political actor that works on cultural cooperation. Doing the conference years is part of this thinking, or going to Seoul and meeting with people is part of things. And that how you as a community of intellectuals and them as an institution can help the cities, the local government, to regain this role is, to me, a master question mark. Because the cities have the power to make the change. It's not a supranational organization, it's not a national state. At the same time, the cities are stuck. I was saying, I mean, this one in particular, but I know colleagues in Seoul or Tokyo or whatever it is, they have to deal with the daily challenges. So bridging these two elements, I think, to answer your question, is absolutely fundamental. Then I have 25 things more to say, but I will later. Thanks.
The remit of the session was actually very challenging, and I mean, you know, one read the title and said, okay, what are we going to talk about? But I think that they have all, in very different ways, put on the table ideas, elements that are absolutely essential in this debate and in what concerns us. I have noted down a certain number of ideas that I have taken up from the speakers. I will now send the ball back to them, but of course, if you have any ideas yourselves, which I'm sure you do, please raise your hand and we will take them also, okay? Afterwards. Yes, in the second round, Simon, okay? Thank you. I do think that, let me go back first to Katherine. She said that Europe is central. I mean, Europe is tiny in the world, but it can take a lead role. It's no longer the center of, but it can indeed take a lead role. And I at least would be interested in knowing how that could happen and how could we, from this very specific sector, be engaged in that, taking up that position. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
It's fine. Yeah. There's two things I'd like to weave together in that. One, the leading role, and the other about vision, or lack thereof. And I think for me, a leading role is not necessarily to be a leader. And leadership is not always about what's at the top and what a single vision or a small group of vision has. It is about how collectively we can look beyond what we are individually. So if we say Europe, make that the individual, very multifaceted and conflicted, and maybe an individual with a personality disorder, can actually come together and think about how it is that we can move forward on these issues that are bigger than one single part of the planet. Ideally, we're looking at this in an association of equals, both within Europe, but also Europe and the rest of the world. And Europe, as other parts of the world should be an equal player, not a leading player. Doesn't need to be the leader of something. So a leading player can be someone who listens very well. Back to the visionary, I think we don't lack voices that vision as much as we lack listeners, because there's plenty of vision and visionaries, and there are plenty of messages, but what politics is not doing is listening to that and enabling that. And the idea that if we can think in a way that is more inclusive, is more empathetic, and is more understanding of how we need to work together and take the small piece that we have to play into a larger arena, we can. The role that culture plays in that, I mean, culture for me is the space within which this happens. It is the space that we move beyond, where empathy grows, and it is the space where we move beyond that consideration, that rather selfish and directed consideration of knowing where we're going. It's needing to work on something together.
Let me pick up on that because, yes, Anupama, I indeed, and Katherine has mentioned it, the idea of equal partnerships. I think that the issue of partnering with is the essence also of cooperation. You work together towards a shared objective that makes sense for all parties involved. So also, picking up on what you said initially, could you move a little bit forward on that? Yes.
Well, I think Katherine here made a very good point about leading versus leader. And I think that's also at the heart of what I tried to mention, that because with cultural cooperation, as I said before, it's a daily challenge to arrive at that space. And I don't think it's easy. A variety of also in Asia, the colonial baggage. So very quickly things can also de-escalate into, I've been called a cultural imperialist, though I come from a country that was a colony, because you represent a certain kind of funding, or you represent certain agendas. Why is the Asia-Europe Foundation so interested in pursuing the new EU, cultural relations strategy? Why? What about the rest of the people, the players? So it's a constant battle of agendas. And I think in this battle, of course, certain agendas dominate, but the key issue also for me then comes back to who the mediators are and what the mediators bring. And this is where I think sometimes organizations that the multilateralism matters, when there are facilitators who bring multilateral interests rather than only bilateral. And I think this is something that is needed now more than ever, both within Asia as well as in the Asia-Europe context. And I think that's where the new EU strategy also lies, because as Luca mentioned, there is bilateral. Bilateral is going on. Bilateral always has, let me show you what we do, you show me what you do. But in multilateral, I think there are a lot more tensions. There is nothing more frustrating than doing multilateral cooperation or attempting to facilitate multilateral cooperation among 51 countries, which we do, taking money from 53 public bodies, countries, and the EU and ASEAN, etc. But there is also nothing more satisfying. But the bigger challenge is also because we live in a world of evaluations and KPIs and board members, and we have our own funders that I must satisfy. It is very difficult to show impact of these things. How do you show the impact of slow, immersive, process-driven cultural exchange? It's setting ourselves up to fail, but I think that's where the challenge is. I'll leave it there.
No, you have just mentioned, I mean, it's been said, but you have pointed to it. Multilateralism should be the modus operandi for everybody. It's, I mean, bilateral is fine, it has to exist, but multilateral and multi-level means engaging in a much more complex way, but also, I believe, much more satisfactory in the long run. Paul, picking up from this, you mentioned the issue about diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. In a multilateral context, in a vision of what the diplomacy of the future could be, what would have to be, from your point of view, what can culture bring to such a new process and a new idea of how to play diplomacy?
It's
I know, it's a big question, but...
impossible question, but
No,
but I say,
no,
globally is that from the meaning and from what I heard, it's certainly a time to act related to a form of responsibility, I heard, and it's certainly the reality of the world of the art and the artist. And if we were in this element of co-creation, interdisciplinarity, there's always somebody who has to take a certain of leadership in the way of creativity. And then not be naive when in each of the works, literature work, of film, there is a leadership in the way of the act and acting. Now, on the level of the political bodies, I think we don't need to go too far. I was referring again to our borders lines, even in, and it was interesting, even the enormous errors we still make about Western, what you said, and Middle Europe and the Eastern European countries' realities. We are complete analphabets already inside of this very small European space, how we connect. Now, on a more global reality, and knowing that for the most of the European countries, economic diplomacy is really the first reality. Look around, smaller or larger countries, for the Benelux, one of the founding members in the space we are, if there was a stability and referring to a certain form of renaissance we want to have again, when we had it in the low countries, it was that because there was in the first place economic stability. There was no war, and education and the learning to live together in cosmopolitan realities was already reality. I'm not referring only to the low countries and the cities and the most democratic cities were created in the way we're living together. We know that in the migration and refugees realities, we see that in cities we are not handling well the models we have. And I think that's interesting to have here a multilateral organization, a foundation, a politician, and a platform, how we have different visions, how to make these realities happen. And the complexity is that we can empower and taking responsibility not on that level. And on that way, and in a certain way, independently of the political realities, because if you look to Asia, Africa, even most of the African countries have no ministries. And if there is already a minister, there's even no administration behind and no budget to make it happen. And if you see what is going on there and in which way we can work with them, and there's, I think, the leadership is to go over the borders, because at the end, if we look around in the whole, we're still white. The diversity is still far away on the level of skills and involvement of these people. I'm one of the first, I think, organizations, we try to change the matrix on disciplines to geopolitical approaches, not related to the geopolitical aspect, but to the aesthetics and the way to come together, because it's not a geopolitical element, because the complexity inside, you were referring to Asia in faith and trade and the economic power related already inside Asia, of inside Africa, of inside Europe, is making a complex way we have to deal with. But at the end is to be stimulated and to take responsibility to make it happen and to deal with it. Even above the political programs, at the end, the most important, in my opinion, at the end, and even what will be discussed in Göteborg, is the Erasmus project at the end, and the volunteers program to stimulate. I'm not related to the Erasmus program, I'm much more related to the Interrail realities. And if we see in the Mediterranean, in the period of colonization, it was the trains who connected people, and still today, even with borders, we need to go above that reality. On the level of policy, I think it's our work to empower the levels we work on the levels of cities, of the nation state. We have to reinvent because we need them. We need that level also, beside the European level, to make that diversity. And I think that cultural capitals on the levels of Mediterranean and other models, we want to export the level of language, learning, because element of communication to understand subtleties on that level. So the element of education, universities, Erasmus, are all these different projects, not inside, but to share with other partners around the world. And knowing that 80 million people from the European continent left Europe 100 years ago, in the realities of migration is a reality we know, and we are confronted for a long time in the migration realities around Europe, Mediterranean, and the world. And it's a part of our duty to act, to take responsibility on the level of cultural art world, to go to these political bodies to improve and to make it better. But we see that resilience and traveling to different countries are artists who don't migrate, even in the different countries in war, how they still make their creativity working there. It's so interesting to see if we go to these places to make that happen, and how they do the work in very complex situations today in Europe and outside of Europe.
Thank you. Luca, picking up on the idea again of that Paul has also explicitated, the idea of political and collective responsibility, cities, culture, how...
Say it again, sorry.
Sorry. Political responsibility. You said the cultural sector is silent, no? and this should not be. How do we do that? How is this taken up? I mean, yes, we've discussed a lot about that, but you are now in a city. You are responsible also for the cultural policies of this city. I take your point on the importance, the fundamental idea of cultural participation, but the reverse is, as you were saying, also being more vocal and taking this political responsibility.
I'm just laughing because
Don't laugh.
I ask for something that I know, should it happen, would be a drama for me in that position. But
I know
think
that, but
the point, the point is, yes, there's a lack of listener, but the listener is among those that make themselves available to listen and are chosen by us as well. So, I mean, whoever goes in politics. I think that something that is feasible is that democracy, the way we have conceived or actually built, doesn't work well. That's something quite clear. So the challenge is, you want to change it, and I would be, mildly opposite to things, or how you make it work. Something that I'm coming to think somehow is that it's that the society need the surge of the third state, as in French Revolution. You need that, and you see that in various forms, in different circumstances, with very bad populistic accents, with different things, there is a push everywhere from a part of society to say, okay, you've done bad, go away, without a theory. So the theory is just get rid of. That is very dangerous. I think that's the only true answer. I think that this community has to take responsibility to play politics. That's as simple as such, and not everybody, but play politics, and not on the basis that you are an artist or someone, but because as you need to have someone that listen and try to transform their narratives in decision. This is the answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luca. I saw a hand raised over there. Are there any others so that I can pick them up and collect them? 1, 2, for the time being? Could you kindly introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Mercedes. Yes, Simon Mundy. I wanted to pull together a couple of things that Paul and Luca said and then refer it to something that Anupama said. I think Luca is entirely right to base it on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think that defines our mission beautifully, and I think that acting within that gives us our mission without a problem. Where we have the problem is moving between two of the things that Paul referred to. The idea of moving from being the fear to the unafraid, and the perceptions of unfairness to perceptions of fairness. And I think those two things are at the center of a lot of the political strife we see at the moment. People have different ideas of what is fair and what is not fair. And that, of course, a lot of that comes down to our political structures. We need a more fluid, as Luca said, a more fluid idea of what Europe is. We need territories that are capable of doing the job as we set them, but not big enough to impose their view on everybody else. And so we go to what Anupama was saying, which is this problem of decolonization. I actually think within Europe now, we're going through an internal process of decolonization, and it's very painful in all directions.
Okay, sorry, I thought it was a question. It's a statement. Fine,
Well, it is a
thank
question.
you.
They can
Okay.
come back on all of it.
Vasily.
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, just two short things that I came across because thanks a lot, Luca, because for continuing this idea of overcoming nationalism and the idea of a nation state. But I think that the problem that you cannot do that properly if you try to achieve that on the city level, because altogether the EU as such today, unfortunately, still is functioning as an old-fashioned nation state. Yeah, it's a Europe of Frontex. And I think that it also somehow involves the problem of citizenship. Because if Europe is consisted of nation states as members, but not of citizens as members, so we don't still have an idea of European citizenship, right? That probably what we altogether need within the EU, but also beyond, is somehow a new European constitution which could claim an individual European citizenship. Basically, we can also refer to the history of the Roman Empire. One of the most progressive achievements of that time was basically the Roman citizenship, which was available for Europeans, for Asians, and for the Africans, right? Not only for some gated community. Because I'm also even not describing like a refugee experience, but also my own one. I'm also pretty privileged. I have a visa. I'm coming to the EU countries like on a constant basis. But the first thing I face, the first thing you are asked about when you just arrive, when do you go back? What kind of welcome culture is that, you know? When you just arrive, the first thing you have to show your hotel reservation, your ticket to go back, yeah, because you are not just allowed to come because you just want. You have to make a reason for that. Yeah. And second, so yeah, European citizenship on an individual level, yeah, maybe that's the idea. Secondly, we also discussed this idea for quite some time with the European Cultural Foundation, that if you again look throughout the world nowadays, from what really unites different contexts in spite of all differences, from Putin to Erdogan and from Orban to Trump, right, is and that's actually the answer somehow can be an answer to the question what is the role of culture and cultural organizations for building the future of Europe. Because what really unites all different contexts is that in all of them, culture and art is under attack today. We are living in the world of a new type of iconoclasm, which is a super violent and very severe one. Yeah, from Charlie Hebdo to Palmyra, from Ukrainian decommunization, the wiping out of all the traces and imagery of the Soviet times, to different kinds of censorship within the EU. So I think that for all of us, for all cultural actors and operators, it's first of all, it's the most important task is what can be done for the future of Europe is of course to establish freedom, to establish real freedom in culture, and to fight any kind and any form of censorship where it's possible. Because if you are not able to do that in culture, it will never be possible to do that in politics. So I think that's the most urgent task to be achieved today. Thank you.
Yes. Vasily points out, and you did it in your speech as well, I personally appreciate that very much, the idea of the Romans did it first, the cives, who is a political subject, and the civitas, which is the community where you make those political rights, you really enact them. So yes, it's the topic also for the young generations. I think that it's one of the sources of frustration for young people today to not be able to see how they will indeed become citizens in the strict term of the sense of this Europe that is always in continuous becoming. I have seen another hand. I apologize very much. I will have to stop at 2:10 because I have a plane to catch. So I will be very strict with timing, and I would like to, sorry, to 10 past, yes, sorry. I have a plane at 2:30, right? I always get mixed up with times. It's awful. And I would like to give them back the floor for a final statement. So I would like to ask you, those of you who have questions, to ask questions, not make statements. Please.
I have a question that relates to a cultural shift away from an economy, a culture that is too sensitive to economy and too little sensitive to human rights or to inclusion. What could be an ally for culture and politics that would replace economy in this enterprise? I have my own answer, but I would like to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. And I saw another hand over there. Okay, 1, 2, please. Over there and then. That will be the last. 4. Okay, go ahead.
Ira Davis. My question is to Anupama. Going right back to something you said at the beginning about the difficulty of working with people whose DNA, whose way of living is about giving answers and authority, and how you have a conversation with people who only give you answers and never share your questions. And I'm perhaps pushing you further than you said, but I see that not only in relationships that are Europe and Asia, relationships within Europe, of course, which are also relationships between Europe and Asia in many cases as well. So my question is whether you think that we're in the right place when we continually talk about structures that are about giving answers, making projects, building things where we have the answers and others are. It's an open question, but I just wanted to bring it back in because I think it was a really important point you raised right at the start.
So if you agree, speakers, what I will do is take the questions. If they're directed to you, then we will answer. If they're general, you can tackle them in your closing statement. So I have one here, and then the 2 ladies here. Yes, I know. Thank you.
Hi, I found whatever I heard from all speakers totally inspiring and provocative, and I heard many key words that come from different fields, such as, besides, of course, culture, economy, politics, democracy, and I am one of those people that believe that all these words and all these fields actually are totally interconnected. And in that respect, I think that within politics and economy and culture, there are many people working in coming up with alternatives. Yesterday we heard in one of the panels, again, the old dilemma between neoliberalism and the state, and I am completely opposed to this. I think there's alternatives that we need to explore, and that culture can play a critical role in coming up with these alternatives. How do you perceive that this can happen in this? I think that we are actually talking about a whole systems change rather than, something that is defined in a very specific area, which might be called culture or politics or whatever. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
Yes, Ivona Price, Intercult Sweden, and I have a question about the international cooperations. I work in Sweden, which is quite a small country, with the international relations, promoting international relations for cultural institutions, and this is getting more and more tough. The interest for international cooperations it's diminishing. Even the Ministry of Culture is now saying that they have difficulties with this subject. So my question is how to maintain the interest for international cooperation of the culture sector, the cooperation between each other across the borders of Europe.
And the last
My name is Joanna Baumann. I've got a very simple question for Vasil because you have challenged us so beautifully. My question is possibly the most difficult of them all. Who should do the change that we are talking about? Who should do it?
who should make this change possible? Right. Do you feel up to giving us a 2-minute closing statement, each one of you? You just take it as you wish. I mean, there many things have been said. People have summed up ideas. I think there's a lot of interest in the room. So let's take up the challenge of Paul. I think that, yeah, great.
I would also refer to our website, to a certain number of initiatives. I think first place, I think we have to take, I said it already, take all of us responsibility on the level of the questions we handled here, on the level of our artists can be coming up with solutions in a situation of crisis, and that we did with the project We Traders, and we studied it in many cities where we saw that independent of the political bodies, artists could come up with a lot of new ideas, and that was also what was said in the project from our friends coming from Kiev. It's really related to people, individuals, artists, they take responsibility and to act. And then I would say that it's not what Kennedy said already, it's not top down, it's bottom up. I think it's very important. Then on the democratic values of Europe, I think we are not at the end of the process. There's a need of reflecting on the process, and the process is that we need to have a common political reality, not elections all over. We have to have an European Parliament. We can all elect together for this president and for these different bodies, where we will feel a common space. And that's an important element on the space we're living in. And I would say it's an element of responsibility in the global reality we are living in the act we have to do today.
Pass it on. Great idea. Yes. No? Luca, come on. You want to be the last? Okay.
Okay, it's fine. It's always better. Just you have more time to think. I'd say that briefly is we are living a time of massive change, so we cannot expect to understand where we are. This is very difficult, honestly. Just being in the midst of something that moves like that, where everything is challenged, and say, okay, that. So even when I listen myself, I say, but is that real? Does it make sense? It does not make sense. I try to adjust. I think that keep doing the exercise of doing discussion of this challenging, trying to deal with the complexity. It's a really good thing, and something that at a certain point I mean, if I survive to this experience, I would like to share is, yeah, you laugh.
We'll wait for you. We'll wait for you.
Do it, and then you say it. But how is the challenge posed by trying to keep together the long term and the short term. It's a massive challenge, because everything is short and the things that need to be done are long term. This is something very, very, I mean, everybody being asked by people, okay, but what have you done in 1 year? I mean, I can list a million things, but if I only think that yesterday the European Commission told that normally it takes 1 year to do a paper, and you ask me if 1 year I change the city, I mean, that's nuts, ragazzi. What are you saying? So this is something, so having communities that keep voicing questions and challenging beyond the obvious, it's already very important. It's already very important. And if that it doesn't limit itself to closed rooms, but goes out as a middle, that helps, I think, very much also those that might be listener to find or they among some that might be listener that find a way to make it through in a system that speaks a different language. It's
maybe picking completely up on the word and the concept of system and need for systemic change. Paul mentioned that we were quite different perspectives, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We had foundations, whether they're funders and advocates, cities, cultural actors, cultural sector platforms, you'd said, and Mercedes talked about multi-layered and multilateral. And I think for me, these things come together in such a positive way to say the more we are doing this and bringing all of the pieces together with a shared interest in and an understanding of wanting to bring change. I mean, I've been very strengthened myself and seeing a great strength in civil society coming together in a more focused and less sectoral or issues-based way. We work with a network of foundations called EDGE, which is Engaged Donors for Global Equity, and its starting point is an understanding that regardless of what area of change specifically you're working in, whether that is environmental change, social justice change, equality, human rights, that aligning these with a collective interest will bring about first an understanding for the need for transformative and systemic change and the desire to move to that. What we try to bring to that is also a cultural lens, in this sense that a system is a system that has an independent life in the thinking that it cannot be directed. A system moves. A system can be attempted to be manipulated, but the biggest role we have to play as both individuals and organizations, whatever our organizational perspective is, or institutional or political, is to say, what is our role and responsibility in that system in relation to the rest of it, so that we can move things forward for a truly, what we hope, a transformational change, and that needs to be based on understanding of human rights, the understanding of the sustainability of the planet, and equality in all of its facets. So yeah, we are constantly looking at where is the space that we play in that system, and to keep it alive, and to lead where it needs to be leaded, from wherever part in the system it is, and yeah, to pick up on the responsibility that we do have, that responsibility to both listen and translate that and amplify the voice.
One thought about leading. I think in Asia there is a sense that, given how things are in the United States, that perhaps there is an opportunity for joint leadership in the Asia-Europe context. And I think when we say the future is multilateral, it's not only in the context of cultural exchange between cultural operators, but I think the future of leadership could be multilateral. There is no one, leader. And to turn to the question about how do we change the paradigm when cultural exchange is perhaps skewed in the sense that some people or some regions, some of us are geared to give answers and expertise. I think this is the fundamental challenge of cultural exchange in our times. Though I feel sometimes in the project proposals we write and the programs we do not acknowledge it. We're so busy doing projects that we don't have time to reflect on how we do it, and I include myself and the work that we do in that, because it's a constant struggle to deliver against certain objectives. So I think what is critical would be to reprogram the way we do cultural projects, to slow down and to somehow be able to justify that also to our funders. And I think this is really critical. And again, to do this with cultural operators from all parts of the world, including those who receive our cultural programming, so to speak. And I think there is very little space to do that except around the coffee table or when you're really angry and venting. There is no proper, legitimate space in which to express these ideas. And another way, I think, for Europe to show leadership in international cultural cooperation, outward-facing cultural cooperation, is to create those spaces. And a long-standing dream of mine is to have an Asia, Africa, Latin America foundation. There is an Asia-Europe foundation because at some point Europe pushed it. There is a Europe-Latin America foundation, but no one would like to invest in a connection between the global south, which I think is critical if cultural operators from parts of the world with low economic indicators but not low cultural indicators can find an opportunity to first talk among themselves before they can talk outside. I think that is also a place for Europe, and perhaps with Europe-Asia, to show leadership and to somehow then slowly push us towards what might be fair international cooperation in future. Thanks.
We were given an impossible remit, but I think that modestly we have, and not modestly in the negative sense of the term, but I think that you have all been capable of voicing very constructively and in an interesting way issues that I think are food for thought. Somebody said it earlier this morning, food is important, but food for thought is important as well. I cannot but thank you all. Anupama, you've come from very far, but Katherine, Luca, and Paul as well. This has been a shared space in which we have shared. This is, Culture Action Europe has called this the Agora. This has been, I think also another further example of a shared space where we have all participated in a debate that I hope and we hope has been useful. Again, thank you all very, very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all for having been here so attentive and for having been with us. Bye.